people seem quite worried about this knots phenomenon. And I just don't see any success case for them achieving their goals. This is nothing in comparison to like the fork wars. This is mostly just like a Twitter phenomenon. And for the majority of people who use Bitcoin, they just have like no concept at all that this controversy is happening. And I've talked to the core developers, and none of them really are JPEG enjoyers. It's less about an endorsement or a condemnation of data storage or JPEGs. In fact, if anything, they're against these things, but they just don't think filters are the way to address this. I actually think that chances are good that JPEGs are going to pop off again on Bitcoin.
The Blockworks Digital Asset Summit, crypto's premier institutional event, is coming back to London this October, the 13th to the 15th. You'll hear from top names across global finance, DeFi, and policy. Think BlackRock, Circle, Coinbase, and the UK Parliament. Notable speakers already locked in include Danny Masters from CoinShares, Jeff Park from Bitwise, and plenty more to come. There's also a VIP dinner on October the 13th. That's for speakers and VIP ticket holders only. It will sell out. It's all happening at the Old Billingsgate in London. Use code SUPPLY100 at checkout for £100 off.
Quick reminder, nothing said on Supply Shock is a recommendation to buy or sell any investment or product. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and the views expressed by anyone on the show are solely their opinions, not financial advice or necessarily the views of Blockworks. Our hosts, guests, and the Blockworks team may hold positions the company sponsors or projects discussed.
Hey everybody, Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian, on X here with another great podcast for you today. We've got Pourteaux, a longtime Bitcoin commentator, Substacker, been with Bitcoin from the very beginning, author of one of kind of the first seminal pieces on Ordinals theory and its relationship to Bitcoin. So with all that's been going on the podcast of late, we've had Shinobi to talk about the rise of Bitcoin knots. You've had Johnny Beers talking about the context of the block size wars and which side he sees as being on the right side of history in the middle of the current maelstrom. So we've got Pourteaux today to take us through his view on the current Bitcoin battle of the day. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Rizzo. So happy to be here. You're a legend yourself, so I feel honored to be invited. So.
Well, I think we will today, hopefully, a conversation between two longtime observers, occasional writers on the subject, maybe of note. So let's maybe start back. We got connected, I think, around the time 2023. Ordinals had really kind of broken out on Bitcoin as a protocol, Ordinals and Inscriptions, that, portended this future in which maybe the crypto industry would find itself coming back to Bitcoin. And now 2+ years later, going on 3 years later, we're into the meat of this experiment, maybe out of the hype cycle of what's happened, and into maybe grappling with the long-term ramifications, the impact of how users feel about it. But maybe let's just start back to 2023. You being a longtime Bitcoiner, why did you get active and energized around, these things that a lot of people consider to be hacks?
Yeah. So for me, I was motivated from a few different points of view on this topic. So like you said, I'm a longtime Bitcoiner, I feel like a lot of Bitcoiners do that Bitcoin is special and like different from crypto. But at the same time, I was like, I don't know, JPEGs are kind of fun. And I was like seeing them take off in other chains. I liked kind of the art and some of the community around it. And so I was like, why can't we have this on Bitcoin? And is it like desirable for Bitcoin? And I had been kind of toying with this idea for a long time, long before like Ordinals was a thing. Like I was putting poetry and op returns and like trying to find ways to use Bitcoin outside of just the main use case, which is like financial transactions and digital gold.
Well, there was a sort of idea of it being a secure database, right, for all sorts of settlement and different types of transactions, even as far back as 2014 and 2015, right? That was in the air in terms of the environment.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely true. And I didn't really uncover that personally until basically I heard about Ordinals, because I guess I didn't realize until that time that I went back and I kind of looked at some of this controversy around data storage. So there was a lot of controversy about how Bitcoin is being used, and there was like different limits at different times and the size of op return because of the different ways that was being used. However, it seemed to me that the perspective of core developers was this is like kind of an externality that needed to be minimized. Like you couldn't get this to go away, but you could try to put it in op returns and maybe restrict the size of those op returns such that it minimized any negative impact on Bitcoin. But as ordinals and inscriptions became a thing, like I tried to talk to people on both sides of this issue, like the smartest people I knew on both sides. I talked to Casey, of course, the developer of ordinals, and I talked to some of my friends who are core developers that were not very enthusiastic about the protocol, inscriptions ordinals protocol. And I tried to really steelman both sides of this and get some of the back history too. Because like you said, there was a long history in Bitcoin of using op return and other data storage methods for all different sorts of things, like counterparty, but also stable coins were done this way. There's all kinds of different like altcoin protocols that tried to use Bitcoin as a base layer. And to do that, they had to store data on Bitcoin. I mean, even Satoshi himself, like him or herself, did the on the brink, basically, message that in Bitcoin. So I feel like for a long time, people have been trying to do some sort of self-expression on Bitcoin. And I in that Substack article that I wrote that kind of helped set off this big interest in ordinals and inscriptions, I tried to really dive into those and uncover the long debate, and the debate continues.
So when you saw, this movement early on, it sounds like you were able to evaluate the Ordinals protocol early. You didn't see this as being sort of a threat, even if we got to, as we eventually did in 2024, this being a primary driver of block space demand in terms of the number of transactions that we've seen. So I guess, how do you feel reflecting on that surge of activity and sort of the original dream, right? Because I do think Ordinals, if you were to evaluate the success of how successful it's been over the last couple of years, there's no, I don't think there's any argument that it's been impactful, right? I think in terms of driving fee demand and sort of transaction demand to Bitcoin, and if you look at it historically, it's been one of the largest drivers. The fact that this caused sort of a multi-year run up in fee demand, it was successful, but maybe the inroads, stopped there. We weren't able to convince more people from the Ethereum and the Solana ecosystems that Bitcoin L2s or different Bitcoin protocols offered a real solution there. How do you reflect on that time, both the successes and now just sort of looking back at maybe what's a high watermark for this?
Well, here's what I think. Like, I don't think that ordinals and inscriptions, like the point of it wasn't ever as serious minded as like the digital gold project. Like, this is just for fun, right? JPEGs are just for fun. This is not like super sophisticated stuff or high-minded stuff the way that, like, I don't get passionate about ordinals and inscriptions the way that I get passionate about like 21 million or like banking the unbanked and things like that are more core to the Bitcoin mission. So I think that, it's just like, it's fun. JPEGs are fun. People enjoy it. I do think that there was like a speculative mania at the beginning, which led to like huge fee spikes on Bitcoin. If anything, that's like probably good for Bitcoin to have had that stress test. But I guess if you're thinking about NFTs and inscriptions as like an industry, and like, is it going to come to Bitcoin, or is it going to stay with other networks? Like, I don't really know or care all that much. I think that Bitcoin is the best network, whether it ends up just being digital gold or whether inscriptions and ordinals will have like another heyday. I actually think that chances are good that JPEGs are going to pop off again on Bitcoin, just because this is cyclical nature of how these markets work. Even if you look at other chains, I do think that Bitcoin is like tailor made to be the best way. Like, this Bitcoin itself is like the best asset, right? And so things that are on Bitcoin for a variety of reasons are, I think, better protected and more resilient than JPEGs or other data storage that are on other networks. So I think that remains true. And even though it's not as popular now as perhaps it was at the very beginning during that big speculative rush, all those JPEGs that were put on Bitcoin between now and then, they're all still there just as reliably as at first. And personally, I'm a bit less concerned about, like, I don't know, the market dynamics of inscriptions and NFTs, and more just kind of, I don't know, I'm more into the resilience of the JPEGs and of Bitcoin itself. So
yeah, there's a couple ways to look at it. As you mentioned, obviously you can't unwrite this data once it's written. So, if you did preserve some type of image or something into the blockchain, it is there, and it does have that permanence that other networks, maybe don't have. But there was this idea, I think, pretty prevalent during the early ordinal inscriptions kind of boom that, essentially block space demand would return, right? There was even kind of a mini media outlet, block space kind of news, that kind of spun up to cover some of the things that were happening. But this idea that kind of data that was input on Bitcoin would generate block space demand, and then that data would sort of gain some sort of value for being on Bitcoin. Obviously, there was a time, I think, where that's true. I think now, we're looking at a lot of these inscriptions, probably below the fees that they paid, to be in the blockchain to begin with. So you look at that just as collateral damage. It doesn't matter that the market dynamics, have made some of the stuff undesirable. It's just, like a kind of just speaks to the fact that it's technically possible.
Well, I don't know if any damage has been done. I mean, these are all valid transactions, and the value of these transactions is whatever the fee that is paid to put the transaction in the blockchain in the first place, as far as I'm concerned. So I don't think any damage has been done to Bitcoin or collateral damage, as you said, from ordinals and inscriptions. I do think that there is this unresolved issue in Bitcoin more broadly. This isn't like an inscriptions thing, but we're just like, we need to have blocks get full, right? Because we need to, as the block reward subsidy goes away, we need to have like some revenue for miners. So hopefully inscriptions and ordinals can play like a role in that in the future, like they did in the past. Right now it's like very meager, but likely it's not going to be the whole solution, and it might just be a small part of the solution. So yeah, I think that remains an issue.
What do you think of what became of the Bitcoin community around this, though? Because I too, I think, did expect ordinals and inscriptions to eventually sort of be embraced as this idea that, we were kind of taking a use case back that sort of started on Bitcoin and sort of returning it to Bitcoin. And because of that, I did think that there was, a lot of really compelling positivistic arguments for, the protocol and for inscriptions, and just the idea that Bitcoin was sort of becoming a more competitive economy. But now we've seen the collateral damage is that a lot of Bitcoiners were kind of drummed up with this narrative that Bitcoin is money, it's only money, must only be money. And now we have sort of the rise of Bitcoin Knots, which is an alternative implementation. But really it has the legacy of a number of projects going back to Disrespector back in 2023 of, different node operators essentially trying to thwart inscriptions from entering into blocks. Why do you think that ordinals and inscriptions, I think they're certainly tolerated by the mainstream. I think that people allow that they exist and are valid transactions, but they don't seem to have been broadly embraced in the way that many of the original proponents sort of maybe envisioned.
Yeah, well, I think that NFTs in general have kind of fallen off. Like, I don't see like huge blossoming NFT communities on other chains too. But I would say that there remain some like, I don't know, blue chips, so to speak, like on all the different chains. And I think that they still exist on Bitcoin as well. I don't want to name specific projects, but I do think that some of the very early inscriptions, for example, or some of the ones that are made by like real artists and stuff, are still quite desirable. And if you look on Magic Eden, you'll still see valuable transactions that are happening with some of those blue chip projects. And it's just kind of similar to CryptoPunks on Ethereum. Those exist on Bitcoin. So, and I guess like this controversy didn't, like we've mentioned before, this didn't really start with ordinals and inscriptions. There's long been controversy, and even Knots has existed for a long time and has filtered out many kinds of different data storage transactions before they started filtering out JPEGs, right? They were, if I remember right, like Luke was filtering out like Satoshi dice because he's anti-gambling. So I think that this controversy has been around a long time. This isn't like a new thing.
Yeah, but what do you make, I guess, of this idea that so many of the people who are within Bitcoin are now, essentially they're pushing for, really what they want is for Core to kind of change their relay policies, right? I guess that's what they're saying verbally, but I kind of struggle to think if that's really what they want. I think really what they want is for the Core developers to sort of be mobilized against this activity in some way, and their sort of failure to conform to that request really, I think, is actually what's driving Knots more than any specific technical complaint, right? It's this idea that somehow the Core developers are not admonishing or disincentivizing this activity enough, right?
I don't know. I mean, I've talked to the Core developers, and none of them really are JPEG enjoyers. So I just think that the Core's perspective on this, at least the developers that I've seen who've commented on it, is less about an endorsement or a condemnation of data storage or JPEGs. In fact, if anything, they're against these things, but they just don't think filters are the way to address this, because they're just not like filters don't stop this activity. So, and I think there's a lot of risk as well of running an alternative implementation that's kind of poorly maintained. The best way to get their perspective is to ask them, but that's kind of what I've picked up just from their public comments and to being friends with some of these people.
But I guess, has it surprised you the extent to which that has become, I would say, maybe not mainstream within Bitcoin, like there aren't maybe major publications writing about it, or in the crypto industry, it isn't maybe talked about. It's kind of known that there's a bit of a fracas, like kind of amongst, the Bitcoin kind of hardcore crowd, but it has gotten quite loud, right? I think in some respects, it's probably about as loud as maybe the original kind of Ordinals and Inscription boom. There's now sort of the backlash.
Yeah. So you're talking about like the Knots folks. Is that right? Okay. Yeah. I feel like, so this relates to like conversation we've had in other contexts, but this is why I think it's important, to talk to Bitcoiners, not just me, but Bitcoiners in general who've been around a long time, because like this controversy around Ordinals and Inscriptions and the kind of the rise of this Knots group and Luke, like this is nothing in comparison to like the fork wars. And I mean, these were things that were covered by mainstream media, like Roger Ver was going on CNBC and denouncing Core. And I just think that the outrage now, so to speak, this is mostly just like a Twitter phenomenon. And for the majority of people who use Bitcoin, that means like holding it or even investing in Bitcoin ETFs or MicroStrategy, they just have like no concept at all that this controversy is happening. And as far as Knots people themselves, I just feel like if they were more technically proficient, they wouldn't have this opinion. And this is just in my opinion, like a Twitter phenomenon, and people want to feel like morally righteous and they want like a battle to fight. And I don't want to get too deep, like trying to psychoanalyze this, but like Bitcoiners have always been like a rambunctious group of people that don't like authority figures and elites. And so maybe some people see Core as like the elite. And I think that they deserve their position because they're like the experts and the best. But I don't think people like their opinions being minimized or kind of aspersions being cast about their incompetence. Although, like I said, I just feel like if these Knots enjoyers were kind of really took a hard look at the arguments that are being made by Core and had an open mind, they would abandon Knots, right? It's just not going to work, and it's not a technically sound idea.
Well, we did see an equal opposite reaction. Leonidas of the sort of dog meme coin community, held a few spaces and did sort of, kind of rattle arms in the other direction, essentially, stating, if something was to happen and the developers were to kind of move to, broadly kind of restrict, the relaying or the validity of these transactions, that, essentially saying that, there are a lot of ways that data could be put in Bitcoin. I thought that his tone was a little over the top, given that, these are supposed to be kind of trinkets like JPEGs and sort of things. But I don't know, I guess, what is your, because again, it's like, I think I'm trying to hint at the psychology of both sides here. I think the Knots community, they really want something not to exist. That, by the definition of computer science, must exist. On the other hand, as much as I support the Ordinals enjoyers and the L2 folks to experiment on Bitcoin, it is a bit harrowing when you hear them come out and say things like, if we're banned, we're going to, we'll encode stuff in transactions and we could be more malicious, or sort of kind of taking a heavy-handed approach. I thought that was, I definitely took a step back from that at a second and said, oh, geez, I don't know if, a dog meme coin is, is a good enough reason to start data stuffing in Bitcoin in ways that might be harmful. So I don't know, Ed, I'm sure your thoughts on that.
Well, here, I think that when you're thinking about programming Bitcoin and Bitcoin being resilient, you have to have like an adversarial point of view. Like, what are all the bad things that people are going to try to do with this protocol? And you have to make it resilient against those things, because we live in a world where there's probably lots of people out there, some of them maybe even backed by states, that are adversaries to Bitcoin. So I don't think that you can rely on people's goodwill or intention. So if like a dog coin can break Bitcoin, then that seems like a big problem for Bitcoin that people should be focused on. So I think Core has taken the right approach, just to assume that these things are going to happen and try to minimize or try to organize it in such a way that it minimizes any externalities or bad downstream effects. And also, like, this is something that just has been going on for a long time. Like, I don't know, when there's been restrictions that made op return too short in the past, like people just find ways to put data in transactions that are, I don't know, less optimal. Like op return is the best, right? Because those op return values can be pruned. But there's other ways to store data on Bitcoin, even if it's in like the amounts of Bitcoin sent, like the number of Satoshis, or in addresses, or in keys, or in, unspendable outputs. Like these are all quite bad ways of including data in Bitcoin. And all of those things have been done before. And so what you need to do simply is just like to find the way to just accept that people are going to try to put data in Bitcoin and try to find the way to do it that does the least amount of damage. And so I think Core is taking the right approach to that.
Right, but I think they're in the middle of like kind of two factions, right? And I think one sort of sees data as something that they want, they very much kind of want on Bitcoin, and they're trying to kind of build projects. And out here close to some of those projects, and you kind of follow what's going on in that space as an investor. Obviously, it seems like the investment enthusiasm has cooled a bit. We heard a lot about BitVM when that came out a couple of years ago. It seems like that has, stalled in terms of progress, in terms of getting something like a better, L2 system to Bitcoin. I'm curious how closely you've been following that, and what you make of this, kind of gap and the rhetoric where, I think if I had talked to somebody like a Dan Held at the beginning of this year, he was sort of, foretelling that, there would be L2s on Bitcoin, and there'd be lots of activity coming over from crypto chains. Has the movement essentially just stalled enough where that's maybe not possible anymore for it to achieve, just because Ethereum and Solana are pumping again?
I don't know. I've kind of, my views on this have crossed the whole spectrum basically because I just been in Bitcoin a long time, and I allow myself to change my mind. But back in the early days, I was quite a maxi, and I wanted everything to return to Bitcoin at some point, whether that was like smart contracts or JPEGs or whatnot. And then I also believe that, these altcoins, as they were disparaged back like in early 2015, 2016, stuff like that, like these would eventually just go away. And this was the prediction that the maxis were making at the time, but they actually don't go away, and they've gained tremendous value. So I think that it's still kind of to be determined whether all of this comes back to Bitcoin. It seems like that hasn't been the trend, right? Like we do have inscriptions.
Well, Ordinals, I think, was the first kind of thing that suggested a redirectional. I mean, that was kind of my interest in it, is that essentially it was the first kind of inkling that, and the way that I always described it is that, this was bringing a market that existed in the crypto economy over to Bitcoin. Obviously, that market has to be strong in order for that demand to persist. And, there was demand for a couple of years, but it showed that the Bitcoin network could take on the capabilities of other networks to a generation of developers in ETH and Solana that I don't think had been exposed to that. But, I think that, what's come of that is kind of the question now, right? And maybe the answer is we don't know, or how much time it will take. It seems like the most pressing thing that's come from it is the knots, the development of the knots implementation, which is, there's a bunch of people who want to kind of explicitly push this transaction activity off of Bitcoin, and you can get into the specifics of, how and why they're doing that. But there's a whole gamut of opinions. Some sophisticated, some not. So I guess, do you think that something good can come of the knots implementation and system? Is there something that they can contribute to your kind of thinking and worldview around Bitcoin, or do you just see them as sort of fighting some sort of a part of Bitcoin that's just some, externality we have to deal with, which is this data storage?
Well, I feel like just like with ordinals and inscriptions, like this is a challenge to Bitcoin. And so I think that it teaches Bitcoin how to be resilient when people are trying to do things like this. Like in this case, it's challenging core and making new implementations. Like how does Bitcoin remain resilient in face of that? Same with when people were in early inscriptions days, when people were trying to put a ton of data on the blockchain. Like how is Bitcoin resilient in that situation? So I think that just by testing Bitcoin, like it's going to be positive for the network and positive for the social layer of Bitcoin. I also think that, I don't know, if people who are into knots and into this controversy take time to learn how to run a node and, I don't know, learn more about Bitcoin, that's a positive thing. But I don't see a lot of negative things. I know some people are really, I don't know, for whatever reason, I'm having trouble figuring it out, but some people seem quite worried about this knots phenomenon. And I just don't see any success case for them achieving their goals. And so more people talking about Bitcoin and learning about Bitcoin is fine by me. I think it's a positive thing.
You could have said the same thing about ordinals and inscriptions, ironically.
Yeah, ordinals and inscriptions were amazing and are amazing for Bitcoin. And in the early days, like they got a ton of people to run nodes and got really interested in how the protocol works. So I still enjoy ordinals and
Well,
inscriptions.
I'm saying it's ironic because you could make the same argument for knots, right? In terms of like if it's a purely educational value, then it's achieving its goal in the same way that ordinals and inscriptions did.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that if you years from now, if you look at this time in Bitcoin's history, I think ordinals and inscriptions will be much more interesting and impactful for Bitcoin than knots. I just feel like knots is so small and peripheral, and there's just no hope in achieving what they want. So I just don't get too worked up about knots. I don't know. Like filters just aren't going to work. So what's the big deal? I don't. They'll realize it at some point, and it'll just be like an asterisk in history. So.
Well, potentially there is the possibility that they do sort of try to launch some sort of fork efforts. There's been some interesting things about
Bitcoin's had some forks before, right? And we survived those, and I think sometimes it's
play
for
it
the
out,
best
like,
when they fork off, right?
I think there are some interesting, scenarios here. Like the Knots maintainers have talked about activating some Bitcoin soft forks that Bitcoin Core has seemed reluctant to, right? So you might actually get a scenario where Knots, maybe decides for whatever reason to be more progressive with development upgrades and adding features and functionality that is ironically sort of desired by the Ordinals and Inscription group, and there's some sort of evolution there towards something else where people move away from core, because there's been a lot of people who've been dissatisfied with core just in terms of it not being seen as progressive in terms of enabling builders with tools, right? That's been sort of an equal opposite. Of course, I think a lot of the FUD around core is super overblown. It's the only working meritocracy we've ever had around development. I don't see it being displaced by knots anytime soon. But there are a lot of people who want new opcodes, and they do want a bit of a forward technical direction for Bitcoin. So maybe there's some sort of alternate hybrid path for knots where it could help push that forward. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that politics is really interesting. Like maybe knots can strike a deal with other people within Bitcoin that want opcodes enabled. I don't think knots, though, is very consistent within its own community about whether they want more opcodes. I think there's a lot of ossifiers within the knots community. So they have to figure that out for themselves, I suppose. But I don't know. As far as I understand with soft forks, you really need broad consensus for these things. So I don't know if knots can really just strike a deal with the ordinals enjoyers. And even, put those two together, it's still a rather small community. I don't think that you just get rid of core that way. So yeah, if knots wants to continue to be relevant, then I think that they should try to kind of see commonality and inroads with core and with kind of more mainstream Bitcoin voices. I don't think their current approach is really that. They seem much more interested in drumming up, drama on Twitter than they do about making inroads and consensus.
I guess the question is, the Knots camp really does see themselves as the heir to the small blockers in the fork wars, right? A lot of their claims are sort of on this idea that they're the grassroots sort of user-centric, implementation, in the same way that the kind of folks who quote triumphed during that era, were maybe the small block kind of implementation, the people who ran the UASF. What do you think about the claim of the Knots participants that they sort of are on the right side of history here?
I just don't think that really follows, because those people still exist today. The people that were in the UASF camp, Adam Back was huge in this, right? In resisting Bcash and resisting SegWit2x, and now he's firmly in core. So I guess Luke is the example that comes to mind. He's always been a small blocker and is a core contributor. So, but I can't think of examples outside of that. In fact, my impression with most of the knots people is that they seem all kind of rather new to Bitcoin. I don't know if is that your impression too, or do you see these people as long time small blockers that have?
Well, this is something I talked to a lot of people about, is that the post 2021-22 era, was filled with a lot of people who were sort of second generation. They had grown up with stories of the fork wars, but they didn't actually live through it.
They should live through it. There's some hard fought lessons from actually living through it. So,
what do you think the biggest lesson you learned was?
Well, I think, again, you have to think about things in context of magnitude. So the magnitude of the fork wars, it's dwarfs this current controversy. It's like this current controversy is just minuscule in comparison. Like there was a lot of fear during the fork wars that they would try to misbrand Bitcoin as Bitcoin Cash. Like maybe they would call actual Bitcoin like core Bitcoin, and they would call Bitcoin Cash as Bitcoin BCH or something like that. And people would go on CNBC, and people would go on mainstream news outlets, and people had Bitcoin.com and the @Bitcoin Twitter handle. And there was like a real threat, in my view, at least, that like there would be a lot of confusion among the public about what actually Bitcoin was. So, and then also there was all these different industry players like Coinbase and big companies that were kind of outside of Core's position on this matter. So I thought that really Bitcoin as an industry broadly was at risk of like tearing itself apart during this time. But the lesson also from that time, in addition to just the sheer difference in magnitude of controversy between now and then, the other lesson was just like the people who win and persevere at the end of the days are the people who stick with like the smartest developers, which are the core developers, right? This is where the actual expertise lies in Bitcoin. And I think that, like I said before, Bitcoiners, we just tend to not like leaders. And so I can understand like skepticism about this point, but like the Bitcoin core contributors and their long history and their like undeniable expertise makes them kind of worth sticking with. And I think that's proven out over time.
Yeah, I think, going back to my read is, 2021 and 22 brought a lot of people who were essentially pushed into Bitcoin because they were dissatisfied with the current politics of the time. And so you have this whole era of kind of Bitcoin being associated with, people who are, not taking the vaccine, they're attending government protests. And Bitcoin was, sort of mainstreaming as a counterculture phenomenon, right? And I do see amongst the not supporters that there's, a heavy contingent of people who kind of came on board through this era. They sort of saw Bitcoin as a vehicle to challenge authority. And I think it's Greg Maxwell in his responses to Bitcoin Mechanic on the subject, where he talks about the phenomenon of looking for authority, that there's a certain class of people who, given freedom, will just look for an authority to blame, for their situation. And so the NOTS participants, they sort of, I think they inherit this kind of 2020, 2021 cycle, idea of Bitcoin is money, it's perfect money, it's freedom money. And then because we were sort of told that it was the specific way and the specific description was given to us, Bitcoin must conform to that description, otherwise it can't be, right? So they'll simultaneously say things like, Bitcoin is worse money because inscriptions and ordinals are possible, when in reality my transactions sort of work just the same as they did before ordinals was possible. There's no, I would struggle. I would really have a high bar. If somebody was to say to me, I would ask, how is your ability to send a Bitcoin transaction gotten materially worse over the last 3 years? I don't think there's a good answer to that. Even when fees were high, I don't accept that, high fees were a satisfactory answer to that, because that was one of the lessons from the fork wars as well. So I don't know. I do think there's a element of politics at play here where, some of the folks in the NOTS camp, I think, are just, they came here looking for a certain type of community. They came from a counterculture, people being deplatformed from the internet. Those were the kind of their main motivations. And now that there's nothing to rail against in terms of the administration kind of, echoing a lot of their preferred, enacting a lot of their preferred changes, maybe they're looking for some other authority figure to rail against, because that's simply their political persuasion, and they're bringing an exterior political persuasion into Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mean, I could believe that. I feel like some people, Bitcoin is just like one element of the culture war for them. And part of the culture war, if you want to be engaged in it, is you just need to be at war and fighting with someone. So just like you said, I think that they have like a friendly administration now with regards to Bitcoin, at least from their perspective. So maybe core is like the next elites that they can try to go after. So I don't really know like NOTS people all that well. Like I don't know their politics, but insofar that they came in to Bitcoin during this time that you're talking about, like 2020 and 2021, I think that makes sense to me.
Well, I mean, I think there's also the tendency in this, in their rhetoric to sort of brand core as, in the sort of kind of evil sort of leftist, kind of canon that political spectrum favors, where they'll talk about how core developers, are compromised, or that they, I don't know, I won't get into specific memes, but there's a heavy overlap between this idea that, running knots is like not getting vaccinated. There's like a really heavy like undercurrent of this kind of memeology and like description, and where they sort of view the core developers as some kind of FDA, right? That's essentially saying, well, here's the best thing for the network, and so I've seen some memes that are sort of like vaccinate yourself against core, or reject the core vaccine.
Oh, that's hilarious. Actually, I agree with them. Yeah, I think that running knots is like not getting vaccinated. That checks out to me. So
right.
People should get vaccinated and they should run core. So, but
yeah, so it sort of like speaks to this idea that there's maybe like a dissatisfaction of like the kind of scientific process that core represents on some level.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good explanation.
Well, I mean, obviously, the whole movement has drifted more, to the right as political sentiments have drifted towards the right, and I think there is, I don't know. I've always expected a rebalancing on this at some point, but for now, I think Bitcoin has mainstreamed as a partisan vehicle, right? I have friends from my life. I'm from the Northeast and in the United States, who will still just flame me on LinkedIn and tell me that I'm supporting fascism by using Bitcoin, and that I should somehow recant for the administration's activities, or I have some responsibility to do so simply because I am in Bitcoin, right? So I don't know. I think that we do have to grapple with that, the Bitcoin ecosystem. We did play politics, in the last election. We were influential on the election. Some people within the industry have benefited from claiming that affiliation, but it has left a lasting impact, right? I mean, Bitcoin is, to an extent, in the U.S. pretty partisan now, no?
Yeah, I think that's unfortunate, but it's true. On the other hand, though, like I can empathize with it. I feel like the last administration was quite unfriendly to Bitcoin and to crypto and to the industry, especially like Gary Gensler was quite negative, and seemed to go out of his way to like obfuscate things and crack down on people and to like give very little clarity on really basic enforcement measures. So I can understand why there's a lot of resentment and anger towards I don't know, the way that things were, but I don't know that kind of partnering with the election of an authoritarian is like the right move, especially if you look at all the negative things, just putting aside like politics outside of crypto and Bitcoin, just look at the negative things they've done within crypto and Bitcoin, just like all this, I don't know, self-dealing and kind of naked corruption. And I don't think that you can do those things and just expect that everyone will forget about it if there's another administration in the future that's more liberal minded. So especially like in the moment that we're in right now, like this is like a very populist moment that we're in the United States and across like the Western world. So, and populism doesn't only exist on the right? It also exists on the left. And I think that if someday the left comes into power and we're still in this populist moment, I just don't think that there's going to be a tremendous amount of sympathy for Bitcoin and Bitcoiners and people who are like, I don't know, crypto rich. Like I think this can also swing the other way. And we really have done a disservice, in my opinion, by, I don't know, I just don't see the outrage that I would have liked to see among Bitcoiners and crypto people for all the grifting that's being done and all the corruption that's happening and all the self-dealing that's happening with everything from like the Trump coin to the NFTs to like World Liberty Financial, and all this stuff is just so nakedly corrupt, in my opinion, and is going to kind of paint crypto and Bitcoin in a very negative light among the public. So
I think the argument from the right has been that Bitcoin and crypto are inherently conservative technologies, right? That's been their attempt to sort of brand the technology as somehow being inherently aligned with them. You don't agree?
Can you steel man that for me? Like, how does that tell me how that makes sense?
Yeah, so the argument goes something like this. It goes, basically property rights are inherently sort of a conservative viewpoint. The left currently rejects the idea of property rights or has a loose or less than absolute interpretation of property rights. Therefore, because cryptographic property rights are, absolute by technical definition, the right is the right party to champion it, whereas the left is less likely to be comfortable with it as a technology. So I think that's sort of one point. I would say the second point would be that there's this belief that within the left, there's a strong desire to redistribute wealth through some of these efforts, like the Federal Reserve and things like that. And there's a belief that they're fundamentally democratic, right? That if you elect democratically elected leader and they decide to turn on the money printer, there's a sufficient enough check and balance, between the populace and the method of the money printer for there to be a reasonable argument that it's democratic, right? I think that would be sort of some of my, friends and contacts on the left who sort of defend like the Nixon shock and defend sort of the money printing era would certainly kind of view that as like a lone good thing that Nixon did. Whereas people on the right, I think, generally are against the Federal Reserve, right, of the 1930s and the 1910s when, we're really a left populist time, as you were saying, right, where, a lot of the efforts, nationalistic efforts of the government were kind of put in place to, give money back directly to the people. So the argument goes something like that, right, and that it's just essentially incompatible with, modern left-wing politics, which essentially are all about, who has how much and whether they are owed it or by which means they've accrued it. Obviously, there's parts of that argument that I agree with, though I would hope that the left wing does sort of wake up and sort of realize that economic value is going to accrue in the Bitcoin system anyway. And that there are, positive attributes of that for, its own causes.
Well, I think a few things. So first, I feel like there should be a distinction made between left and liberal. So I don't think that Bitcoin is like something that the left champions, that's for sure, and doesn't align with like left values. And I think a lot of what you described, like property rights, like these are liberal values, right? Even though you describe them as conservative, I think like maybe small L liberalism like is all about property rights and individual freedom and civil liberties, and even like self-sovereignty is a huge thing within liberalism. Like just like we believe that you should be able to own and custody your own Bitcoin, like we believe in property rights. I don't know, if you think about it very abstractly, it could be like Ukraine has a right to their self-sovereignty, right? And to their property and their land, and these shouldn't be forcefully taken by Russia. So I know that's quite abstract, like from Bitcoin, but it's like the same underlying value in self-sovereignty and in property rights. And in, I don't know, everything from free expression to transparency, and even consensus itself, like is a liberal democratic value and is like the basis of Bitcoin. So I think that Bitcoin really pairs quite well with liberalism. And some of those values are perhaps conservative. I don't really think that we have a conservative administration currently. It seems like much more like state nationalist or authoritarian. Like these, like free expression and consensus and self-sovereignty are just not values that I see really as championing in the current administration. In fact, I just don't think the current administration really knows or cares about what Bitcoin even is. Like this is just kind of like a way to enrich themselves, in my view.
I call them the America First Bitcoiners, and I think the thing that you have to realize about them is that they care about America first and Bitcoin second, and therefore, I think Alex Gladstein had a nice article in, I can't remember, was it a few days ago, but Trump is not the Bitcoin president, he's the stablecoin president, right? So this idea that, really why the conservatives have kind of flipped over to the, Bitcoin kind of worldview is the ability to strengthen the dollar. That's their primary motivation for advancing the ecosystem as a whole. But yeah, I think that'll play out over decades, right? But I do think that the conservatives have at least woken up to that idea, and they did embrace the idea. And to the extent that they're using Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies to push their own politics, they're not unlike maybe these other constituent groups like the Ordinals enjoyers or the Knots folks.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I think everyone should use Bitcoin. So I don't care what political party you're in or what country you're in, I think that Bitcoin should be a big tent and it should be welcoming. And so I think it's fine that if like, I don't know, American nationalists want to use Bitcoin, like it should be for everyone. But an issue that I see is that we have thrown in way too much with one camp, and that all the media and attention around Bitcoin is always associated with kind of the right and the rise of the right in America. And, honestly, Bitcoiners deserve this because we've through different lobbying efforts, we've put tremendous amounts of money into basically the Republican Party and different candidates on that side who kind of to champion the cause of Bitcoin and crypto. And I just feel like we need more balance. And there's lots of us out here who have more kind of liberal-minded values and views. And some of us, like myself, that's like what brought us to Bitcoin in the first place. So I think elevating those voices and in trying to be more bipartisan and have more broad appeal to the American public is going to serve Bitcoin better in the long term.
Yeah, in defense of, I have a lot of friends at the Bitcoin Policy Institute. I have a lot of friends at some of the, organizations that worked with, Trump early on. Of course, the Bitcoin magazine apparatus being heavily involved there. And, the steel man was, essentially, if the one side is going to, show you favor, it's in your best interest to help support them until the other side, starts to show some interest. And, there really hasn't been a ton of interest from the Democratic Party as far as I can tell or have seen. If you look at Fair Shake and the political action committees, they gave quite equally to Republicans and Democrats. But, it's that there was a certain group that just seems more enthusiastic about it at the end of the day, right? And how can you control that one side of this political spectrum just doesn't want to hear about the solutions that you have to offer?
I mean, I agree with you. I don't think that the Democratic Party, they're definitely not blameless in this situation. Like, they should also be.
There was a brief moment in time where Kamala Harris almost attended the Bitcoin conference in 2024. I was there.
She should have done it. Yeah, she should have done it.
I watched that correspondence happen.
Yeah, tell me more about that. So, I didn't see this like you did. So,
so there was so when Trump announced that he was coming to the conference, there was an equal opposite effort to get Kamala Harris to speak. I mean, she had just been appointed the nominee the week before, so that there was all sorts of things that were off with the timing. It would have been her first, speaking engagement as a political candidate. So essentially, she was President Biden was dropped out of the race on the Sunday before the Bitcoin conference, and there was a sort of last minute effort to sort of get Kamala to be interested in coming to the event. There was some tepid enthusiasm on her side. There was an attempt to scheduling it, but it never came together for various reasons. Some of the political supporters in Bitcoin, like the Winklevoss twins, David Bailey's, et cetera, kind of used that political moment as a way to kind of say that Harris wasn't, the Democrats weren't supportive as Bitcoin. So it became a politicized moment, as everything does these days. But it did seem like at least there was some sort of effort and maybe an alternative timeline there where, some engagement had been successfully done.
Yeah. Well, I think that hopefully Democrats have learned some lessons in their losses and will update their views on this. And I think that if they're going to do well politically in the future, that's kind of like the right thing that a political party does, is like admit defeat and then try to learn from your mistakes. And I'm hopeful that there's more like tech positive people that come to the forefront in the Democratic Party because of that.
Well, cool, man. It's coming full circle. We talked some politics. We talked about current Bitcoin politics. Just curious, your final thoughts. If we're in the Fork Wars 2.0, where do we go from here?
TikTok next block is all I have to say. So,
Pourteaux, appreciate you coming on the podcast. Where can people follow you on Substack, Twitter? Where's your preferred medium these days?
Sure. Yeah. On Twitter, I'm at Pourteaux, and on Substack, I'm read.pourteaux.xyz. And happy to see you on either one.
Well, we'll be happy to see you this October. Of course, Blockworks headed out to the UK, the United Kingdom, in London for the next Digital Asset Summit. They'll be there bringing a Bitcoin perspective to conversations across the crypto spectrum. You're going to hear from Nigel Farage, Joe Lubin, a host of other crypto names. You can go to blockworks.co/events. Find out more about everything that's going on at the Digital Asset Summit just weeks away. For now, this has been Supply Shock, a Blockworks podcast.